Picture this. It's 1323 BC, somewhere in the Valley of the Kings. The sun has just set, and two men are moving fast through the dark, carrying nothing but a bronze chisel, a rope, and years of patience. They've been planning this for months. They know which tomb. They know roughly where the door is. And they know that whatever is inside is worth more than 100 lifetimes of honest labor. They find the sealed entrance. They start chipping at the plaster, and then one of them hesitates. Either because carved into the stone above the door, just barely visible in the flickering torchlight, there are words, hieroglyphs, and maybe this man can't read them himself, but he's heard what they say from someone who can. A warning, a promise that whatever power sealed this place is still here, still watching, and still very much capable of reaching out of the dark and destroying him. Not just killing him, destroying him. His body, his soul, his name, his children's futures. Everything gone. He hesitates for 3 full seconds. Then greed wins, as it almost always does, and he keeps chipping. But here's what that man didn't understand. What almost no one has fully appreciated until modern archaeologists started piecing it together. That inscription above the door wasn't the trap. It wasn't even close to the trap. It was a decoy. The real security system, the one that was actually designed to work, was already running, had been running since the moment the tomb was sealed, and it operated on a plane that no chisel could ever touch. Welcome. Tonight, we're going inside the most sophisticated supernatural security system ever devised by human hands, and we're going to find out whether any of it actually worked. We all think we know the story of the pharaoh's curse, right? A spooky warning carved into a tomb, promising a nasty end for anyone who dares to disturb the dead. It's a great story. It's the kind of thing that launched 1,000 Hollywood movies. But what if the curse was just the welcome mat? The first, most obvious tripwire in a security system, so much more complex and so much more strange that it makes the curse look like a "Beware of Dog" sign on a vault door. Ancient Egyptian priests knew that a simple "keep out" sign wasn't going to cut it. They'd seen what human greed could do. They knew that no physical barrier, no stone, no trap, no hidden passage was ultimately going to hold back a determined person with the right tools and enough desperation. So they built something else, something that worked on a completely different level. To protect their ruler's soul on its journey to the afterlife, they didn't just write threats. They built a fortress of magic. This was an active, multi-layered defense system powered by enchanted objects, divine spells, and rituals specifically designed to call on gods and monsters to guard the tomb. Not as a symbolic gesture, not as a comfort to the grieving family, but as a literal, functional security apparatus that they believed, and I mean genuinely believed, would continue to operate for eternity. This isn't just a story about a curse. This is the story of an invisible supernatural bulwark, a magical force field constructed with as much care and technical precision as any engineering project in the ancient world. And to understand it, we first need to understand what it was protecting, because it wasn't protecting treasure. Not really, it was protecting something the ancient Egyptians considered infinitely more valuable than gold. It was protecting the chance at eternal life itself. The eternal problem. So, why all the magical security? Why go to these extraordinary lengths? Or to answer that, we need to understand how ancient Egyptians actually thought about death. And I promise you, it is nothing like what you're imagining. For the ancient Egyptians, a tomb wasn't a final resting place. It wasn't a grave in our modern sense, a place where the body was put away and forgotten. It was a launch pad, a vital, functional machine for eternity, a piece of sacred technology that allowed the soul to begin its incredibly dangerous journey into the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, the realm of the dead. Now, the Duat wasn't a serene paradise. It wasn't even a quiet, gray waiting room like some ancient conceptions of the afterlife. It was a gauntlet, a crawling, writhing nightmare of terrifying beasts and demonic gatekeepers, each one more dangerous than the last. There were serpents big enough to swallow the sun. There were lakes of fire. There were courts of divine judgment where your heart was literally weighed against a feather, and if it came up heavy with sin, a monster named Ammit, part lion, part hippopotamus, part crocodile, was waiting right there to eat it. The famous Book of the Dead was basically the soul's GPS for navigating all of this. It was a collection of spells, passwords, and instructions, essentially a cheat code for the afterlife, that told you what to say to each gatekeeper, how to address each divine judge, and how to avoid the more catastrophically lethal hazards along the way. Wealthy Egyptians spent fortunes commissioning personalized copies. The more spells you had, the better your chances. But here's the thing. The journey through the Duat was only possible if everything back at the tomb was in order. Because the ancient Egyptians believed in a complex, multi-part soul. The Ka was the vital life force, a kind of spiritual double that needed to be fed, literally, in with food offerings to survive. The Ba was closer to what we might call the personality, the unique essence of the individual, often depicted as a human-headed bird, capable of flying out of the tomb during the day and moving through the world. And then there was the Ak, the glorified, immortal spirit that emerged when everything worked correctly, when the Ba and the Ka were reunited with the physical body each night. That reunion, that nightly return to the body, was everything. Without it, there was no Ak. Without the Ak, there was no eternal life. And crucially, that reunion happened at the tomb. The body was the anchor. The tomb was the hub of the entire operation. This is why tomb robbery was considered one of the most devastating crimes imaginable in ancient Egypt. Not just because of the stolen gold, though that was obviously bad, but because desecrating a tomb, destroying a mummy, scattering the remains, it could sever that essential connection. It could trap the soul between worlds, wandering and homeless for eternity, unable to complete its journey. Think about what that means. Every night out in the Duat, the spirit of the deceased was fighting its way past monsters, reciting the right password, navigating by the light of a magical map. And every night it needed to come home, back to the body, back to the tomb. And if the tomb had been ransacked, if the mummy had been torn apart by thieves looking for the amulets tucked into its wrappings, the soul comes back and there's nothing there. No body, no anchor, no way to complete the cycle. Eternal life canceled. So the stakes were literally infinite. And that's why the priests went to extraordinary lengths. Hidden passages, false burial chambers designed to fool robbers, pits and deadfalls, physical obstacles of every kind. But they knew, they'd seen it happen too many times, that human ingenuity and human greed could eventually outsmart almost any lock. They needed a defense that worked on a higher plane. They needed something that would keep working even after the last priest was dead, even after the last living person who knew the tomb's location was gone. They needed something that operated entirely on its own, powered not by human vigilance, but by divine power. They needed Heka. Heka was the ancient Egyptian concept of magic, but not magic in the frivolous, fairy tale sense. Heka was considered one of the fundamental forces of the universe. It was described in some texts as existing before the gods themselves, as the power by which creation was made possible. The word Heka was both the concept and a deity, a god who was present at the moment of creation, at the moment of each sunrise, at the moment of every sacred ritual. To use Heka wasn't to dabble in the supernatural. It was to tap into the operating system of reality itself. And the priests who built these tombs were not amateurs. They were trained specialists, masters of a tradition stretching back thousands of years, with access to libraries of accumulated magical knowledge that modern scholars are still working to fully understand. When they set about protecting a tomb, they brought everything they had. And the result was a security system of terrifying sophistication, and it had layers. Layer 1. Words as weapons. The first layer of this magical defense system is the one we all know, the curse. But let's actually look at how these things worked, because the reality is both more interesting and more psychologically sophisticated than the movie version suggests. Egyptian curses weren't random expressions of supernatural rage. They were precisely engineered pieces of psychological and magical warfare. Their primary audience was any potential robber who happened to be literate enough to read them, or who could find someone to read them aloud. And in a society where the afterlife was as real as the ground under your feet, threatening someone's eternal soul wasn't a metaphor. It was the most credible threat imaginable. The curses operated on several levels simultaneously. First, there was the social legal angle. Many tomb inscriptions appealed directly to the king, to officials, and to the gods themselves to take action against violators. They essentially put the robber on record as having committed a crime witnessed by divine powers, a kind of magical testimony that would be presented at the final judgment of the soul. Even if the robber got away with the crime in life, the inscription was evidence that would follow them into the afterlife. Then there were the more visceral threats. The Old Kingdom tomb of an official named Kentika Ikeki contains a warning to anyone who enters impure. I shall seize his neck like a bird. Think about how that image lands in a society that spent enormous intellectual energy on the question of what happened to the physical body after death. To have your neck seized like a bird was to have it broken, snapped, a violent physical death. But in the context of magical language, it was also a threat to the Ba, often depicted as a bird, and therefore a threat to the soul's ability to fly freely between worlds. Another class of curses attacked legacy and lineage. His heir not inherit. In a culture where the continuation of your name and your line was considered essential to a kind of immortality, this was a devastating threat. If your name was forgotten, if your family line died out, if your tomb and your offering ceased, you ceased in a very real sense. The curse promised to cut that chain. In some curses were remarkably specific about the mechanism. They called on particular gods to act as enforcers. The cobra goddess Wadjet, who appeared on the royal crown precisely because she was a destroyer of enemies, was frequently invoked. The scorpion goddess Serket, the fearsome lion-headed goddess Sekhmet, whose domain included pestilence and divine retribution. These weren't vague supernatural threats. They were specific divine agents with specific powers, and the curses were essentially formal commissions, contracts signed in magical language, instructing these deities to act. But for all their menace, curses were still just a warning sign. They were the lock on the front door, effective perhaps against someone who was superstitious and poorly informed, but useless against a determined professional who knew that the odds of getting caught were low and the rewards were enormous. The really potent magic was built into the tomb itself, and then it was designed to work long after the doors were sealed, long after anyone was around to read the warning. It's worth noting here because the legend has taken on a life of its own. Despite the stories that exploded after several members of the team associated with Tutankhamun's excavation died, no actual curse was ever found written in that tomb. The famous Curse of the Pharaoh is largely a creation of early 20th century journalism, when amplified by coincidence and the very human tendency to find patterns in random events. The real magical defenses of Tutankhamun's tomb were considerably more subtle and considerably more interesting than any inscription. Layer 2. The architecture of the sacred. Before we get to the enchanted objects and the divine guardians, I want to take a moment with something that often gets overlooked: the tomb itself as a piece of magical architecture. To the ancient Egyptians, space was not neutral. The orientation of a building, the direction a doorway faced, the angle of a shaft, the dimensions of a room, all of these were considered to have magical significance. The Egyptians were among the most precise astronomical observers of the ancient world, and that precision fed directly into their sacred architecture. Tombs were aligned with extraordinary care. The Great Pyramids, of course, are the most famous examples, but the principle extended down to far more modest burials. Orientation toward the north, toward the circumpolar stars that never set, the stars the Egyptians called the imperishable ones, was a declaration of the deceased's intent to join those eternal lights. Orientation toward the east was about rebirth, the daily resurrection of the sun. Orientation toward the west was toward the land of the dead, the Duat, the place where the sun god Ra made his nightly journey. The burial chamber wasn't just a room, it was a cosmological statement, a model of the universe arranged in such a way as to give the soul the best possible footing for its journey. The ceiling was often painted with stars or with the body of the sky goddess Nut, arched over the deceased as she arched over the entire world. The walls were covered in maps, spells, and images of the afterlife journey, not as decoration, but as magical reality. In Egyptian thinking, the image of a thing was, when in an important sense, the thing itself. A painted boat on the wall was a real boat, available to the soul. A painted feast was real food, available to the Ka. This is the context in which the physical and magical defenses of the tomb operated. They weren't additions to the architecture. They were the architecture. The whole structure was a machine, and every element had a function. Layer 3. Building a supernatural fortress. This is where the real magic happens. And beyond the curses and the sacred architecture lay the heart of the tomb's security. A layered system of rituals and enchanted objects that created a supernaturally protected space. And I mean that quite literally. A space that was different from ordinary space, charged with divine power, policed by divine agents. It started with the very walls of the burial chamber. Spell 151 from the Book of the Dead was a complex ritual that involved creating 4 magical bricks from unbaked clay. Not fired clay, unbaked clay, raw, close to the earth, still holding the potential of unformed matter. Each brick was inscribed with a protective spell. Each one held a specific amulet, and each one was placed in a niche carefully carved into the four walls at the four cardinal points of the compass. Think about what this created: an invisible square of divine power, anchoring the four directions of the universe around the deceased. Each brick faced a different cosmic direction and called on different forces. One might call on the god Imseti, who guarded the south and protected the liver of the deceased. Another called on Hapi, who guarded the north and protected the lungs. The four cardinal points were, in Egyptian cosmology, not just geographic directions, but the pillars holding up the sky itself. And now in the burial chamber, those pillars were replicated in miniature, with their divine guardians installed at each corner. One of the spells associated with this ritual declared, "I am he who stands behind the Djed pillar. I am the protection of the deceased." The Djed pillar, the backbone of Osiris, god of the dead and resurrection, was one of the most powerful protective symbols in the Egyptian magical vocabulary. Stability, endurance. The promise that what was placed here would not be disturbed. This wasn't a threat. It was a statement of active, ongoing guardianship. The burial chamber, once these rituals were complete, was not just a room with a dead body in it. It was a consecrated fortress, guarded by divine powers at every compass point, built on a cosmological foundation that tied it to the structure of the universe itself. Layer 4, the enchanted objects. Now we come to the amulets, and this is where the magical engineering gets almost breathtakingly detailed. And the hundreds of amulets tucked into a mummy's wrappings weren't just good luck charms. They weren't the ancient equivalent of a rabbit's foot or a horseshoe over the door. They were technical objects. Each one was a physical instantiation of divine power. A battery charged through ritual, holding a specific kind of magical energy designed to perform a specific function. The selection of amulets for a royal burial was the result of centuries of accumulated priestly knowledge, refined through careful observation and magical tradition. Different amulets were placed at different positions on the body, corresponding to the parts of the body they were meant to protect. A heart scarab went directly over the heart, because the heart was the seat of the soul and would be weighed at the final judgment. A correctly charged heart scarab contained a spell literally instructing the heart not to testify against its owner. Or a headrest amulet went under the neck to prevent decapitation in the afterlife. Amulets of the Eye of Horus went over wounds or injuries to magically heal them. The materials mattered enormously. Gold was the flesh of the gods, associated with the sun and with divine power. Gold amulets carried solar energy. Lapis lazuli was the color of the night sky, of the deep blue of the Nile at flood, of the hair of the gods. Lapis amulets were connected to the heavens and to divine hair, to divine power made visible. Carnelian was the red of blood and fire. Carnelian amulets were associated with vitality, protection against physical harm. The Ankh, the famous looped cross, represented life itself, the breath of the gods, the power to animate. When a god held an ankh to the nose of a deceased person in tomb paintings, they were literally giving them the breath of divine life. An ankh amulet was life in your hand. It's portable and available. The Djed pillar represented the stability of Osiris, the promise of resurrection, the endurance of the soul through death and rebirth. The Tayat, or Isis knot, was the girdle of the goddess Isis, and Isis was, among other things, the greatest magician in the Egyptian pantheon. The spells associated with red jasper Tayat amulets explicitly called on Isis to protect the body. They were essentially hotlines to the most powerful magical being in the universe. And then there was the Eye of Horus, The wedged eye, the most ubiquitous protective symbol in all of ancient Egypt, and for good reason. The mythology behind it is extraordinary. Horus, the falcon-headed sky god, had his eye torn out in battle with the chaos god Set, a battle that represented the eternal struggle between order and destruction. The eye was restored through the magic of Thoth, and in its restored state it became something even more powerful than it had been before, a symbol of healing, of wholeness, of protection so intense that it was considered a shield against virtually any harm. A wedged eye amulet was essentially a piece of that divine healing, deployed as a weapon against anything that might threaten the deceased. When you lay out all the amulets found in a single royal burial, and Tutankhamun's mummy was wrapped with 143 of them, you're not looking at a collection of pretty objects. You're looking at a comprehensive defensive system, every component precisely positioned, every material and shape carefully chosen for its specific magical properties. It's the equivalent of a modern suit of armor, except that instead of protecting against swords and arrows, it was protecting against demonic attack, divine judgment, and the catastrophic hazards of the afterlife journey. Layer 5, the Divine Army. But enchanted objects on the body were still passive defenses. What the priest really wanted, what the full elaboration of the system eventually included, was active guardians. An army of supernatural beings whose entire existence was dedicated to protecting the deceased and repelling any threat to the tomb. This started with the Ushabti figurines. These are the small, mummy-shaped objects you've probably seen in museum cases, often in great numbers. The ideal set for a royal or wealthy burial was 401 figures, 365 workers, one for each day of the year, and 36 overseers to manage them, one for every 10 workers. Their job, according to Chapter 6 of the Book of the Dead, was to answer the call when the deceased was summoned to perform any manual labor in the afterlife. When the divine administrators of the underworld called out, "So-and-so, we come and plow this field," the Ushabti would step forward and say, "Here I am." They were supernatural labor contractors, summoned by name, endlessly available. But the divine army went well beyond these worker figures. The Egyptians also employed 4 sacred figures, the sons of Horus, as permanent guardians of the internal organs of the deceased. After mummification, the organs were removed and stored in canopic jars, each jar topped with the head of one of the 4 sons. Seti, human-headed, guarded the liver. Hapi, baboon-headed, guarded the lungs. Duamutef, jackal-headed, guarded the stomach. Kebesenuef, falcon-headed, guarded the intestines. The 4 jars were placed at the 4 corners of the burial, mirroring the 4 magical bricks. Every direction was covered. Every organ was protected. The goddesses Isis and Nephthys were explicitly invoked as protectors who wrapped their wings around the coffin, and in fact, their outstretched figures appear literally carved into the sides of the most elaborate sarcophagi, their wings embracing the mummy within. These weren't decorations. They were statements of divine presence. Isis and Nephthys were there, physically present in the form of their images, performing their protective function for eternity. And then there was Anubis, the jackal-headed god of mummification, of tombs, of the weighing of the heart. Anubis was the original embalmer. In the divine undertaker and in countless tomb inscriptions, he is explicitly identified as the guardian of the burial. A relief in the tomb of a New Kingdom official named Maya identifies Anubis as the one who protects the burial, not who protected it, past tense, but who protects it, present tense and eternal. He is still there. He is always there. What makes this particularly fascinating is the way the Egyptians conceived of divine presence. For them, the image of a god wasn't merely a representation. It was a vehicle through which the god could be present. When you inscribed Anubis on the wall of a tomb, you weren't making a picture of Anubis. You were giving Anubis a home in that tomb, a place to inhabit, a form through which to act. The inscriptions, the paintings, the carved reliefs, they were all invitations. Come in, take up residence, be here in this space forever. The tomb, when fully realized, was therefore not an empty room with a mummy in it. It was a populated space, humming with divine presence, every inch of it charged with a different layer of protective power. The opening of the mouth, activating the system, all of this preparation, all the amulets, the bricks, the spells painted on the walls, the ushabti arranged in their boxes, the canopic jars set in their positions, none of it was live until one final, crucial ritual was performed. In the ritual that turned the whole system on, it was called the opening of the mouth. This was the most important funerary ritual in ancient Egypt, and it was performed at the entrance to the tomb on the day of burial. A priest wearing the mask of Anubis, literally embodying the god, becoming the god for the duration of the ritual, stood before the mummy and performed a series of ceremonial actions with specific sacred instruments. A curved adze tool made of iron, and considered to carry the power of the sky and of the circumpolar stars, was touched to the mouth, eyes, ears, and nose of the mummy. The same instrument was then used to open the mouths of the significant statues and inscriptions inside the tomb. The logic was this: a carved or painted figure, until the opening of the mouth, was inert. It was potential energy, unactivated. The ritual awakened it. It gave the image the ability to breathe, to see, to act, to speak, to perform its function. Why the guardian figures painted on the walls could not actually guard anything until their mouths were open. The ushabti could not answer the divine call until they were activated. The gods depicted in the sacred imagery could not truly be present until the ritual invited them in. Accounts from texts and tomb paintings show elaborate processions, animal sacrifices, the burning of incense, the pouring of water and oil. The whole ceremony could take hours, and at the end of it, the tomb was not just sealed, it was activated. The magical security system was switched on, humming with divine energy, every component performing its function. And then the door was sealed and the priest walked away. And everything inside, the spells, the guardians, the enchanted objects, the divine presences, was left to do its work for eternity, unsupervised, self-sustaining, running on the power of the universe itself. A case study in fear, the serpent's tomb. Perhaps no discovery better illustrates this obsessive magical engineering than the 2,500-year-old tomb of a royal scribe named Jehutimhat, found at the ancient cemetery of Ebusir, not far from the step pyramid of Djoser. And what makes this tomb extraordinary isn't gold or jewels or spectacular wall paintings. It's the sheer concentrated intensity of the magic woven into every surface. When the burial chamber sits nearly 50 feet underground, itself a statement about the seriousness of the protection, this wasn't an accessible tomb. Getting to the burial chamber required descending through a series of shafts and corridors, through deliberate dead ends and false passages, before finally reaching the real thing. And when you get there, the walls are covered, not just decorated, covered densely in an unprecedented concentration of spells, and almost all of them are about snakes. This needs a moment of context. Snakes were a constant daily hazard in ancient Egypt. The desert and the fertile Nile Valley were both home to a variety of deadly species, and death by snakebite was common enough that we have medical papyri dedicated entirely to its treatment. The Egyptians took snakes very seriously indeed, but they also understood snakes as powerful, ambiguous spiritual beings. In the mythology, snakes were among the most dangerous inhabitants of the Duat. The great serpent Apep, also called Apophis, was the embodiment of chaos, an enormous, eternal serpent that attacked the solar bark of Ra every single night, threatening to swallow the sun and plunge existence into darkness. Defeating Apep required the combined efforts of Ra and all the gods aboard the bark, plus the magical assistance of priests on Earth who perform rituals every night to weaken the serpent's power. So snakes were both a physical danger and a cosmic, mythological threat. And Jehutyamhat, it seems, was particularly afraid of them. His tomb walls are a masterclass in what scholars call apotropaic magic, magic designed to turn away or repel evil. But the spells reveal something deeply sophisticated. While many of them were aimed at protecting the scribe from venomous bites, essentially enchantments against the physical danger of snake attack in the afterlife, others took a completely different approach. They actively enlisted serpents as powerful protectors of his mummy, the very thing he feared, the very thing he was protecting himself against, was also being recruited to his side. This is ancient Egypt's version of, if you can't beat them, join them, except it works the other way around. Through the correct magical formulas, certain serpents could be bound to serve as guardians. The cobra in particular had this dual nature. The Uraeus serpent on the pharaoh's crown was also a destroyer of enemies, spitting fire at anyone who threatened the king. To have a cobra defending your tomb was to have one of the most terrifying forces in Egyptian mythology working for you. Analysis of Jehutyamhat's skeleton revealed that he died young, around 25 years old, and that his spine showed severe wear consistent with years of crouching over a writing surface, bent over papyrus, grinding through the demanding work of a royal scribe. He was young, he had a physically demanding job, and presumably he had a great deal of time to think about what he feared. The sheer detail and volume of his tomb's snake spells suggests something that archaeology rarely lets us see: a glimpse of a person's private terror. A young man who knew he was going to die, knew he was going to face the Duat and all its dangers, and who worked with his priests to address his specific, a personal fear with the most powerful magic they had available. His tomb wasn't just a resting place, it was an enchanted fortress, custom-built to fight a very specific enemy, designed not from a template but from fear, and in that specificity, it's deeply, surprisingly human. The royal treatment. Tutankhamun and the full arsenal. If Jehutyamhat's tomb shows us the personal dimension of magical protection, the tomb of Tutankhamun shows us the full institutional arsenal. And despite the fact that Tutankhamun is the most famous ancient Egyptian pharaoh in the modern world, the magical architecture of his tomb is still regularly underestimated. We tend to focus on the treasure, the gold mask, the nested coffins, the chariots and thrones and golden shrines. And yes, all of that is extraordinary. But let's look at the security structure. The burial chamber contained a series of 4 gilded wooden shrines, nested one inside the other like Russian dolls, each one covered in spells from the Book of the Dead. each one adding another layer to the magical barrier around the body. The outermost shrine nearly filled the entire room. The inner shrines became progressively smaller, and inside the innermost shrine was the stone sarcophagus, and inside that the three coffins, the outermost of gilded wood, the middle of gilded wood, the innermost of solid gold. And inside all of that, the mummy itself with its 143 amulets. Each layer of this system was both a physical and a magical barrier. The shrines were inscribed with specific protective spells. The sarcophagus bore images of the four protective goddesses, Isis, Nephthys, Serket, and Neith, standing at the four corners with their arms outstretched in eternal protection. The canopic shrine, which held the king's organs, was similarly guarded by goddesses and sons of Horus. And throughout the tomb, on the walls, on the objects, on the coffins, beyond the amulets, there was a constant overlapping chorus of protective magic, spells layered on spells, divine names invoked over and over. It was, as one Egyptologist described it, a kind of magical redundancy. If any single layer failed, the next layer would hold. The fact that the tomb was broken into twice in antiquity, both times apparently by thieves who got only as far as the antechambers before being frightened off or caught, suggests that the physical security worked better for Tutankhamun than for most pharaohs. But it also suggests that the magical deterrents were not the primary line of defense. The real protection ultimately was geography. A small, inconspicuous tomb tucked into the floor of the valley, quickly buried under debris from other excavations, forgotten. The bigger picture: magical systems across Egypt. The tomb wasn't the only magical security system at work. It was part of a larger ecology of protection that surrounded the pharaoh from birth to death and beyond. The royal palace was protected by the same logic. Amulets were buried in the foundations. Protective inscriptions guarded the doorways. The uraeus on the crown, that raised cobra, was not decorative. It was a weapon, and believed to spit fire at enemies of the king. When the pharaoh wore his crown, he was literally carrying a divine protector on his forehead. The temples that served the royal cult, the memorial temples built alongside or near the tombs, were designed to perpetuate the offerings and prayers that fed the ka of the deceased king. As long as the temple was operating, as long as priests were performing the daily rituals and laying out the offering tables, the dead king's ka was sustained. The magical security of the tomb was therefore part of a larger institutional system, one that included living priests, ongoing rituals, and the machinery of state religion. The problem, of course, was that institutions fail, temples fall into disrepair, priesthoods are disbanded, dynasties collapse, and when the institutional support structure failed, the tomb was left alone, with only its inherent magic to protect it. This is one reason why the magical systems became increasingly elaborate and self-sufficient over time. Early tombs relied heavily on ongoing cult activity. Later tombs, particularly those of the New Kingdom, were designed to be as self-contained as possible, loaded with so many spells, so many enchanted objects, so many divine presences, that they might theoretically function forever without any external support. It was a recognition of reality. The priests knew they couldn't guarantee that their successors would maintain the rituals. They couldn't guarantee the survival of the state. What they could do was pack the tomb so full of magical protection that even if everything else failed, the defenses might hold. The priests who built the fortress. We should spend a moment with the people who actually designed and implemented these systems. Because they were remarkable individuals who deserve more recognition than they typically receive. Egyptian funerary priests, particularly the Hem-Netcher priests, the servants of the god, were not simply religious functionaries performing rote ceremonies. They were trained scholars with deep knowledge of theology, astronomy, architecture, medicine, and what we would call psychology. Their training could last decades. The most senior among them held positions of enormous power and influence, so trusted with secrets that were considered too dangerous for general knowledge. They were also, in many cases, the architects of the tombs themselves. The design of a tomb wasn't left to a general builder. It was a theologically complex project that required someone who understood the cosmological implications of every decision. Which direction to orient the burial chamber, which spells to prioritize, which divine guardians to invoke for this particular individual. We know from papyri that these priests maintained libraries of spells, constantly updated and refined. Spells were tested in a sense, evaluated based on their theological logic and their resonance with the accumulated tradition. New spells were added as new threats were identified. Old spells were updated to address changing theological understandings. The collaboration between the dying king or official and his priests was often personal and detailed. We've seen this with Jehotiamhat, where the specific fear of serpents led to a customized magical program. Similar examples can be found throughout the archaeological record. Tombs that seem to address specific anxieties or specific aspects of the occupant's life and death in ways that go beyond the standard template. These priests were, in the most meaningful sense, engineers. Their medium was not stone or bronze, but divine power, and they brought to their work the same systematic, detailed, technically precise approach that the greatest engineers of any era bring to theirs. The inevitable breach. Did it work? So with all these layers, curses, sacred architecture, magical bricks at the 4 cardinal points, hundreds of activated amulets, canopic guardians, divine army, opening of the mouth ritual, nested layers of inscribed shrines and coffins. The big question is, did any of it actually work? The archaeological answer is brutally honest. For the most part, no. Where it's estimated that the vast majority of tombs in the Valley of the Kings were robbed within 100 years of being sealed. 100 years. All that elaborate preparation, all those centuries of accumulated magical knowledge, and the average tomb lasted a century before human greed found a way in. Even Tutankhamun's famously intact tomb, the one we celebrate as a miraculous survival, was broken into at least twice in antiquity, and as evidenced by the clearly disturbed and hastily repacked material in the antechambers. So what went wrong? How does an invisible supernatural fortress fail? The evidence points to the oldest problem in security, the inside job, and it points to it with uncomfortable consistency. The workers who built the tombs, the craftsmen of the village of Deir el-Medina, who spent their lives carving and decorating royal tombs, were remarkably well positioned to rob them. They knew the layouts, so they knew which shafts led where. They knew the difference between the real burial chamber and the decoy chambers because they'd built both. And while they were relatively well compensated by ancient Egyptian standards, they were still, at the end of the day, working people with working people's vulnerabilities. Debt, illness, crop failures, the unpredictable disasters that could upend a life in an ancient agricultural economy. When times were desperate, some of them made a terrible calculation. The treasure was right there, a few hours' work away. The curse on the wall was frightening, but hunger was more immediate. The risk of being caught was real, but the reward was unimaginable. And some of them weren't even desperate. They were simply corrupt. We have actual records, papyri from the reign of Ramesses IX and later, of investigations into tomb robberies. Suspects were questioned, confessions were extracted, often under torture. It must be said, and the testimonies reveal a world of organized criminal enterprise with networks that included not just workers, but minor officials, corrupt guardians, and middlemen who could fence stolen goods. The punishments for those who were caught were brutal enough to make your hair stand up. Torture was standard. Amputation of the hands or nose was not unusual, and the most severe punishment, reserved for the most serious cases, was impalement on a stake. A death deliberately designed to destroy the body and therefore obliterate any chance of the perpetrator's own afterlife. The Egyptians, with grim ingenuity, turned their religious beliefs into an instrument of criminal deterrence. You rob a tomb, you lose your own eternal life. And still the tombs were robbed, because the temptation of unimaginable riches proved, over and over, stronger than the fear of any curse. The gold was real. The punishment was real. The magic was, well, the magic was a matter of belief. The question of belief. This brings us to perhaps the most interesting question of all, one that archaeology and religious history can help us approach, but never fully answer. Did the priests themselves believe in what they were doing? There's a tempting modern cynicism that wants to read the whole apparatus, the curses, the amulets, the elaborate rituals, as a kind of theater, a spectacular performance designed to impress the living and comfort the grieving, without anyone actually expecting it to work in any literal sense. The priest knew it was symbolic. The people knew it was symbolic. Everyone was in on it, more or less. But there's very little evidence for this reading. What the textual record actually shows is something quite different. Deep, genuine, intellectually serious engagement with the magical system as a real system, and the refinements of spells over centuries. The intense theological debates about which formulas were most effective and why. The personal customization of magical programs to address individual fears and circumstances. These are not the behaviors of people performing cynical theater. The better comparison might be to modern medicine. When a surgeon prepares for an operation, they perform careful, meticulous rituals, washing hands in a specific way, arranging instruments in a specific order, following protocols that have been refined over centuries of practice. They do this not because they believe in magic, but because they understand that each step has a functional purpose and that collectively they produce a result: a sterile field, a prepared patient, a better chance of survival. The Egyptian priests understood their rituals in similar terms. Each step had a function. Each element of the system contributed to the whole. The logic was not the same as modern scientific logic, but it was logic internally consistent, rigorously applied, and based on centuries of accumulated experience and tradition. If the tombs were robbed anyway, this didn't necessarily invalidate the magical system in the eyes of its practitioners. It might simply mean that the robbers had more powerful magic of their own, or that the divine guardians had been improperly invoked, or that some flaw in the ritual had left a gap in the defenses. So the same cognitive moves that modern people make when a medicine doesn't work, the dosage was wrong, the patient was too far gone, there were complicating factors, were available to ancient Egyptian priests when their magic appeared to fail. Legacy. Echoes of the magical fortress. The magical systems developed to protect Egyptian tombs didn't disappear with the pharaohs. They echoed forward through history in ways that are still visible today. With the amulet as a concept, the physical object charged with protective power, worn on the body or placed in a significant location, is found in virtually every human culture. The mezuzah on the Jewish doorpost, the evil eye bead of the Mediterranean and Middle East, the saints' medals worn by Catholics, the protective knotwork of Celtic tradition, the red string worn for luck and protection across dozens of different cultures. All of these are, at a structural level, doing what the Egyptian amulets were doing, anchoring divine or supernatural protection in a physical form, making the invisible visible, carrying the defense with you wherever you go. The idea of inscribed protective texts, words that perform their function simply by existing, appears in the Book of Psalms, in Islamic Quranic inscriptions placed over doorways and in homes, in the runic inscriptions of Scandinavian tradition, in the yantra diagrams of Hindu and Buddhist practice. On the Egyptian insight that language was a form of power, that the written word could act on reality, has been one of the most persistent ideas in the history of human religion and magic. The concept of the divine guardian, the god or spirit explicitly assigned to protect a specific person or place, appears in the Roman household lares, in the guardian angels of Christian tradition, in the household gods of Shinto practice, and in the protective deities assigned to specific places in Buddhist cosmology. The Egyptian innovation of formally commissioning divine guardians through ritual and inscription, and then fixing them in place through sacred images, is arguably one of the most influential religious ideas in history. In the tomb itself, the sacred space designed to bridge the gap between the living and the dead, between the temporal and the eternal, is an idea that has never left us. Every memorial, every grave, every monument to the dead is a small echo of that original Egyptian insight, that the dead need a place, and that place has power, and that power deserves protection. What remains? The physical gold was almost always lost, the treasure that the priests worked so hard to protect, the gilded coffins, the jeweled collars, the golden statues and alabaster vessels, was taken, melted down, sold, dispersed to the four winds, and is gone forever. Tutankhamun's survival was the exception so remarkable that we're still talking about it 3,000 years later. But maybe we've been missing the point. Maybe we've been measuring success by the wrong metric. The curses, the amulets, the spells. This entire supernatural security system was ultimately designed to do one thing: protect the soul, not the treasure. The gold was in the tomb because the soul might need it. The food offerings were there because the Ka had to be fed. The Ushabti were there because labor might be required. The amulets were there because the journey was dangerous and the traveler needed every advantage. The treasure was instrumental. The soul was the point. And in a strange way, the magical system did exactly what it promised. Not in the way its creators intended, but in a way that might have satisfied them if they could have seen it. The priest said, "We will make this name last forever. We will ensure that this person is remembered. We will build a defense so formidable that even the erosion of centuries cannot erase this individual from existence." And here we are, 3,000 years later, saying the names: Tutankhamun, Jehutimhat, Maya, Kentika Ikeki. The physical remains are gone, plundered, scattered, but the names survived. The stories survived. The system of belief they trusted with their eternity survived. not as a living religion, but as a subject of deep study, genuine reverence, and relentless curiosity. The priests wrote on the walls, "This person was here. This person mattered. These powers are watching over this place." And through the strange alchemy of archaeology and scholarship and human fascination with the past, those words are still being read. The spell is still working. The guardians are still, in some sense, present. In the silent dark of those underground chambers, the ones we haven't found yet, the ones still waiting under the valley floor, something is still there. Whether it's the literal divine presence the priests installed, or simply the accumulated weight of human belief and human intention and the extraordinary enduring strangeness of the ancient world, is a question each of us has to answer for ourselves. But it leaves you wondering, even with the gold gone, even with the mummies disturbed, even with the centuries of silence, could it be that in some way that matters, the magical fortress is still standing? The story of Egyptian tombs is a constant battle between sacred protection and human greed, between the infinite ambitions of faith and the immediate pressures of survival. A story we are still uncovering piece by piece with every new excavation, every newly translated text, every technological advance that lets us peer inside a sealed chamber without opening the door. If you've enjoyed this journey into the hidden world of ancient magic, there is so much more to explore. When we've barely scratched the surface of the Book of the Dead, of the incredible variety of Egyptian funerary traditions across 3,000 years of history, of the archaeology of Deir el-Medina, and the fascinating lives of the people who built these monuments. Each of those is a universe unto itself. If this video got you thinking, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep exploration is worth pushing to more people. Subscribe for more journeys into the history that doesn't make the textbooks. And drop a comment. What aspect of ancient Egyptian magic would you most want to explore next? We came in looking for a curse. What we found was something far stranger and far more human. A civilization that looked at death and refused to accept it as an ending. That looked at the darkness and built a lighthouse. That looked at the unknown and responded with extraordinary, meticulous, ingenious hope. The magical fortress around a pharaoh's tomb was never really about keeping thieves out. It was about keeping the soul in, keeping it anchored to the world, keeping the name alive, keeping the flame burning in the dark. The gold was bait, the magic was the point. And the people who built it were not primitive or superstitious in any dismissive sense. They were doing what humans have always done and what we are still doing today. Refusing to accept that the people we love simply stop existing and building the most extraordinary structures our imagination and skill can produce to make that refusal real. The tomb builders of ancient Egypt built better than they knew. Their fortresses fell, their gold was taken, their mummies were disturbed. But their names, their stories, and the magnificent strangeness of what they believed, that has proven harder to steal than any treasure. It's still here. It always will be.